Please be seated. The court is back in session, and Judge Laverne will have the floor to continue putting questions to the expert. You may proceed, Judge Laverne.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, now we're going to come specifically to your trip in December 1978, and you told us that you had met Mr. Caldwell in Beijing, and that Mr. Dudman, you had heard about him in rather strange circumstances, but wasn't there a difference between, on the one hand, the journalist, that is to say you and Dudman, and Caldwell, who was a professor? And what was this difference?
Yes. Richard Dudman and I were invited as journalists, and that was our category. Malcolm Caldwell was invited as a friend. We had talked about friendly delegations before, so he was definitely a friend, and we were journalists. When we met in Beijing, we all traveled together on the same flight, but when we arrived at Pochentong, Richard Dudman and I were taken in one car, and Malcolm Caldwell was taken in another. And not often, but in significant moments, we were separated in that way. And the presumption is they accepted that we were journalists who would ask questions they didn't particularly want to answer, and that Malcolm Caldwell had come as a friend who would be very supportive of what they were doing.
So now I would like to show you a document. This is a report, Index E3/1156. Could someone please provide the expert with the report? Thank you. So I'd like to specify the ERNs of the document: English 0052 4507 to 08, French 00 80 71 42 to 43, and Khmer 000 32 944 to 945. So this document is addressed to the much beloved and respected brother, and it is signed by Khan and Mut. It is dated 8 September 1978. And what's interesting in this document is that this document contains the list of the wishes expressed by the visitors with regard to the places that they would like to visit and the topics they would like to discuss, or the people that they would like to meet. Maybe I'm going to focus more specifically on the part that concerns you directly. I'd like to, however, let you know that the English and French translations are a little bit different. That is to say, in the French version, we can clearly, Professor Caldwell's clearly identified, and in the English version, it is references made to Dr. Cartwell. Mr. Dudman in the English version is presented as Mr. Lidman, and you are presented as Miss Becker, so I apologize. But that's not the most serious issue. What's most important is what I'm going to read, free translation. Miss Becker, age 30, single, was in Cambodia for 2 years during the period of the despicable Lon Nol, and she wishes, colon, to travel to the border. That is her priority request. And 2, to know how Cambodia is waging war and how Cambodia organizes itself to survive. And 3, she wishes to see how the cooperatives are organized, and the cooperatives located in Kompong Chnang, in Takeo, and in the Northwest Zone as well. And she would like to know how, right now, the cooperatives are managing for fish and mines. And 4, with regard to social action and culture, she would like to meet the former citizens and to understand how society is organized in order for them to go live in the countryside. And she would also like to speak with the Minister of Education. And 5, she would like to get information on the government and on the party, and she'd like to meet the leaders, and she'd like to speak with Ieng Thirith, with Bong Khieu Ponari, with Bong Khieu Samphan, Sihanouk, Hu Yun, and Hunim. And then, of course, to visit the sewing Kompong Chnang, Angkor, the northwest area, and to take a boat along the Mekong and to take the train. 7, she would like to inform herself on how the army is organized and interview Bong Prime Minister, meet the ambassadors, visit Phnom Penh on a bicycle, and she would like to get information on the Cham population. So does this list of wishes correspond, as far as you remember, to what you requested from the Khmer Rouge authorities, from the Democratic Kampuchea authorities at the beginning of your trip?
Yes, and we also asked for the interview with Pol Pot. It does make sense to read it in sequence because we did try to coordinate the three of us so that we could sort of cover the same ground. I mean, include all of the different ideas.
You said that you expressed the wish to meet Pol Pot. I believe that's indeed something that was noted because you said to interview Bong prime ministers. So it's probably to him that this is referring to. But regarding the other people, did you insist to meet, for example, Sihanouk, Huyun, or Hunim? And what were you told with regard to that?
We were told that Sihanouk did not want to see us, and I believe that was the only one where we were told that he truly didn't want to see us, and the others that we asked for were unavailable, either in the countryside or unavailable. No, we were not told that Huyun and Hunim were dead.
So, last observation with regard to this document, it is signed by Khan and Mut. And I would like to let you know that the document was presented during the testimony of witness Nikan. And Nikan authenticated the document, saying that the document, that he was indeed the author of the document. Did you know Nikan? Do you know Nikan? Have you met him? Do you remember who asked you these questions?
I can see his face, that's all. That was our first day. I remember Mut, I believe, but not Nikan, no.
And Mut? He was?
He was one of the cadre, Mitmut, who would be with us at different intervals during the trip.
Well, Nikan was testified before this court, and he identified Mut as being possibly His Excellency Ketchun.
Ketchun? Then there's another Mut that I met. No, I do not, in fact, remember Ketchun being at that meeting at all.
Well, you tried to describe the trip that you had done, and you spoke then about a visit that was supervised, a visit of the revolution. I think the expression you use in English is, can you describe to us why you used such a description? What led you to describe that visit in that way? You also said, it's a bit further on, we were like the three blind people in the fable who are trying to imagine the elephant.
The easiest way to describe it is we were under the equivalent of house arrest. So we could not move without someone escorting us. We could not choose what we wanted. We could not talk without usually Tun Prasit there and doing all the translation. As you know, I described the various times that I went out on my own, and I was always brought back and reprimanded, and eventually all of our guest houses were locked, and we were not allowed to leave. So you got a glimpse of this, you got a glimpse of that, but the fable of what is an elephant if you only can touch the trunk or the tail. So it was an incomplete, to put it mildly, and it was very Potemkin village. We saw what they wanted to see, and every once in a while you get a glimpse, and you'll see in the other reports that they became angry if we took photographs of the bedraggled children and the obvious poverty. I've never been on a trip like that in my life, before or after, where every move was controlled.
And you say that from time to time you got glimpses of the other reality, the reality that was different from the reality that was presented to you. You in particular spoke about a walk a visit of Phnom Penh that you did on your own. What did you see then?
The Phnom Penh we saw in the car when we arrived was immaculate. We only went down the main streets, Nordam or Manivang. We were taken by car everywhere, not allowed to walk. When I escaped, I went to the side streets, and I saw beneath this lovely facade were the other reality of abandoned villas and homes and shops, sometimes filled with, for instance, stacks of furniture or old air conditioners, other times just garbage, everything overgrown, sometimes rather filthy. That's on the side streets. Then I walked up further. You could see clumps of workers, men in black pajamas, waiting for a ride on a truck or whatever. And then I got all the way up to... So our house was in the old Cham compound, and I walked all the way up to the Hotel Royal, and right where the René Descartes Lycée was, further down, I think, towards Phnom. I went into the hotel. It looked great on the outside and awful on the inside. And then I met a couple of cadre who let me take their photograph. And then they started to get frightened of me. And then I began to feel that maybe I'd gone too far, and I started to walk back. And remember, this is the first few days, so I didn't realize just how severe the restrictions were. I hitched a ride with a cadre on a moped. This is coming down now. We're coming down Manivang. And by this point, they had taken roll at breakfast, and they knew I wasn't there. So a Mercedes, one of the comrades came and screeched to a halt and had me come in, and that's when they read me the riot act. But that's what I saw. But in a sense, what made my stomach drop was what I didn't see. I kept thinking I'd turn a corner and I'd see real life. You know, I'd run into some kids playing a game, or some women talking, or maybe anything that resembled. Cambodians are, as you know, lively people, and there was nothing. And that's what started to make me pause. No matter where I went, it was empty, regimented. You know, just clumps of people who didn't respond, and you know, the laugh and the songs and all that stuff, not gone. So that was what was missing, was almost profoundly more upsetting to me than what was there.
And you stayed in 1973, 1974 in Cambodia, so therefore you met quite a few people then. And when you returned in 1978, did you meet any of these people again that you had known before?
No.
Now I would like to speak a bit more in detail about someone who played a very important role during your trip, who is Chun Prasit. Chun Prasit, if I understood properly, you met him previously in New York. Is that the case?
Yes.
Chun Prasit, you told us, gave you a certain number of explanations on what Democratic Kampuchea is. He's going to provide you with documents, and he spoke to you in particular about the Black Book, the Black Paper. Do you remember this document? Had you seen this document before, or what can you tell us about it?
Yes, I had seen it before. If I'm not mistaken, I first saw it at the UN in 1978. I had already read it by the time I got to Phnom Penh, and then they gave us more copies. I believe it's the book that lays out Democratic Kampuchea's reasoning for saying that Vietnam is the aggressor in the war, and essentially the Vietnamese wanted to recreate the Indo-Chinese Federation. It's sort of what was remarkable at the time was how quickly old allies became bitter enemies, and the language was very severe.
Well, Chun Prasit, you questioned him on the existence of the violations of human rights in Cambodia, and I think you questioned him several times about this. Do you remember the way Chun Prasit would react to those kinds of questions?
Yes, he considered them bourgeois. He considered my line of questioning overly concerned with people who had lived in Phnom Penh and not concerned enough with the peasantry. And I explained to him, to no avail, that in order to answer charges about human rights violations, it would behoove him and the government to show that the stories about the former inhabitants of Phnom Penh were false, because the new people were the ones who, in the documents, were treated the most poorly. And he rejected that there was any distinctions and became irritated at my line of questioning.
You said the following: the only Cambodia that you were allowed to see during this trip was Democratic Kampuchea as Prasit would imagine it. We could meet no one. We would eat separately. We would be lodging aside from the people. The only people we could speak to were the people that Angkar had chosen to represent Cambodia. And Prasit would translate each time what these people would say. Does that correspond to what you remember?
Yes.
I will refer to another document, E3/96. This is the interview of Thiounn Prasit. That interview was carried out by the investigators of the co-investigating judges. The ERN in French is 00342219 and in English 00346944. Thiounn Prasit explained as follows. In fact, he had served as an interpreter on several occasions. He explained that were there many government delegations? No. The objective of that visit was to show that everything was going well, everything was organized beforehand. The places visited were not always the same. We often went on the road to Phnom Penh, Kampong Thom, and Siem Reap. There is another document, and that document is E3/1697, and it is the autobiography of Thiounn Prasit. Two questions on this subject. Did Thiounn Prasit tell you what were the different stages of the revolution in Cambodia? Did you receive any information, ideological information on the line of the CPK? Did he tell you that he had written his autobiography?
He certainly, during the trip, regularly described the politics and the policy of Democratic Kampuchea, and that would obviously include the ideology. Did he tell me he wrote his autobiography? No.
I will read out part of that autobiography, and please tell us whether it corresponds to anything you may have heard. And this is what is stated therein. He explained earlier that he had been to China before he returned to Democratic Kampuchea, and this is what he said: before going back home at the end of 1975, I hadn't realized that the 17th of April 1975 indeed marked the end of the Democratic National Revolution. I had thought that that revolution was going to continue for some time. I wasn't sufficiently interested in the major measures such as the evacuation of the population, the abolition of money, because I did not know then that there were extraordinary measures of the class struggle and the continuation of the socialist revolution and the socialist edification. At the time, there were indispensable but provisional measures, and that were required by a devastating war. And that observation was based on an ideology that was not practical and that was completely cut off from what was happening within the country. And I reasoned in light of the books I had read, after studying them all along and after understanding all the measures completely that the party had taken with a view to pursuing the socialist revolution and socialist edification. In the history of socialist revolution in the world, there are 3 dates in all, notably October 1977, the first socialist revolution, that is, in the first October 1917, beg your pardon, the Soviet socialist revolution, then the Chinese Revolution, and the 17th of April 1975, the Khmer Revolution. And then he adds, the measures taken by the party to pursue the socialist revolution have never existed before. I therefore had the conviction then that if those measures had not been taken, Cambodia would have faced an unthinkable situation and would have lost its national independence, sovereignty, and the blood of more than 1 million of our inhabitants would have been shed for nothing. If the party had not taken those radical measures, the Vietnamese would have penetrated and trampled underfoot our territory. Let me specify that this document is dated December 1976 and that Chun Prasit explained that that autobiography was written at the request of Ieng Sary and that at the time he was suspected of being a CIA or KGB agent. Now, do these words, National Democratic Revolution, Socialist Revolution, exceptional measures of the class struggle, were they expressions that Chun Prasit used during your visit?
They sound familiar. I'm not sure if exactly that way, but very much this sounds very familiar. And the rationalization for abolishing money for evacuation, for the massive evacuation, that all sounds very familiar. Yes, and the different kinds of revolutionary, which I have to admit that I don't understand always the distinctions myself, but I certainly heard them from him. He was in charge of telling us that, giving us the history and putting in context.
What is particularly important to stress here, perhaps, is that he explains all the measures that were taken to avoid a Vietnamese invasion. And this is what he says: if the party hadn't taken these radical measures, the Vietnamese would have penetrated and trampled underfoot our territory, end of quote. So when we talk of the evacuation of towns, reference is made first and foremost to the Vietnamese. Is that something that you felt?
No. On the contrary, on the forced evacuation, he very much emphasized what the DK considered the threat of an American bombing, and we had a conversation or two about the fact that the Americans stopped bombing Cambodia in August 1973, and the likelihood was small. And then he would say, "Well, there's no food; we'd sent them out." I never heard him say that it was to avoid a Vietnamese invasion. And on abolishing money, it was put in terms of finding equality for everyone, sharing everything. And he even said, your economy uses credit cards. I bet you don't use your money very often. Vietnam was never mentioned.
It will be difficult for us to go into detail and to talk about all the places you visited and all the people you met. But I will perhaps focus from time to time on certain important details. So, on the first day of your visit to Phnom Penh, you had explanations given to you regarding, you saw propaganda films. The next day, you were led to visit the Mekong. You went around the Mekong. You saw refineries. You saw rubber factories, banana plantations, and you visited an institute called the Institute for Training and Scientific Information, where you met a brother of Chun Prasit called Chun Mun. Can you tell us of that visit to the training institute?
This was the institute/factory that had caught my attention in the Yugoslav film. So when I first went there, I said, aha, that's it. Very young children, small, standing on boxes to work on, I can't remember what they were building, but Chun Mun was presented as number 2 for this institute, whereas a cadre was the number 1. Number 2 being the intellectual, the number 1 being the party guy. He said, this is innovative. He would teach these young kids how to be engineers in this month's worth of study and that month's worth of practice and so on and so forth. And I already knew the story of the Tuan family. And after a while, I said to Prasit, why are you pretending you don't know your brother? And that led to a little bit of nervous laughter. But it was remarkable because of the artificiality of this distinction between the intellectuals and the party, the people who were the cadre, the party people who were considered of a pure stance. It was not convincing that these young kids were going to be the future engineers of the country.
Do you recall where that institute was situated and how many children were there?
It was in the old French Quarter near one of the French Catholic buildings on the riverfront, I think on the riverfront or right near it. It's in the old French Quarter. A couple dozen children, I'm not sure. I think we saw that many. I can't remember how many were actually there. That's memory.
Tuen Mun was also interviewed by investigators from the Office of the Co-Investigating Judges, and it's document E3 5304, and in that interview he explains that he was director of a laboratory but also director of an institute which he situates in the former Soviet training center, and he said that according to his reckoning there were about 300 children there, and that these were undoubtedly the children of party cadres. Does that jog your memory? Do you know where the former Soviet Training Institute was located?
No.
Very well. You explained that the training, as explained by Tuen Mun, was quite revolutionary, since in 6 months children who was almost illiterate were going to acquire such a high level as fourth year in the French system, and after that they would go and work in a cooperative for 6 months, and after 18 months they would acquire the level of qualified engineers and eventually become engineers. Was that indeed the revolutionary education process that Mr. Tuen Mun explained to you? Mr. Tuen Mun, who himself had a brilliant academic career.
Yes.
And then you went to Nuon Chea. Can you tell us what you saw in that region, the region of Nuon Chea? Can you please tell us of the zones you visited, zones close to the front? Did you visit and meet people at the military headquarters on road number 7?
This is the trip to Crottier?
I noted a trip to Nuon Chea. I also noted that you went to the military headquarters situated on road number 7, where you met Comrade Penh, I beg your pardon. Can you tell us about him? Does that remind you of anything?
Yes, Comrade Penh was an important part of the trip, and he was meant to show us that, in fact, Democratic Cambodia had held off the Vietnamese, that they still held the front. We were escorted by several jeeps of armed soldiers. We got close enough to the front so that we could see an exchange of artillery in the distance, the puffs of smoke. They had us take our photograph there so we could show that we were at the marker that showed that Democratic Kampuchea had held the line, and to show that the foreign broadcasts were wrong, that they were full control of the country. I think by that time we were hearing over BBC that Pol Pot and the leadership were in discussions about abandoning the city. I think it was around that time.
Do you remember interviewing Comrade Penh and asking him what had become of the former officers of the Lon Nol army? You asked whether the refugees had been killed shortly after the war. Did you ask him questions regarding that?
Yes, he probably had, he answered very confidently. He was a very convincing man. And he said, the former military officers, if I'm not mistaken, he said that those who were capable were reintegrated. I do not believe I can't remember the response to the refugees. What did I write?
I will try to sum up what you wrote, and this is what I noted. Penh answered that he did not have any idea as to what had happened to former Lon Nol officers, and he provided information on the fate of Vietnamese infiltrated soldiers who had entered the East Zone, and he specified that we eliminated them. Does that ring a bell to you?
Vaguely. It's been too long.
Very well. Perhaps your memory would be better regarding the visit to the Prialias, the cooperative called Chevreuil Doré, that is the golden deer. Well, you talked about that cooperative saying the following: it is truly something out of the film. Potemkin village. Were you surprised to find that what you saw was very different from what you had gathered from refugees' testimonies? You also made mention of the fact that everyone had 3 meals a day, and they even had dessert after the main course and that they had 3 days of rest. Does that remind you of anything?
Yes, and this is what I was told. I did not see them eating and resting and all that sort of stuff. It was remarkably handsome, not just from what refugees had said, but also what I'd seen on the roads. You could get a sense of how other people lived just slightly from what you could gather from the roads, and nothing had prepared us for that. And if you saw the photographs, you could tell there was also a nervousness among the people to be seen with us, and they hesitated, some of them hesitated to answer the questions, but I also knew that it was a major spot on all the other friendly delegation tours. So I knew that this was the one of the favorite spots to take all the delegations friendly, and then us.
Do you remember stopping at a dam near Stung Chinit, 1st or the 6th January dam? Was that dam in the process of being built, or it was already in place, had already been built?
It was being repaired. The monsoon had been heavy that year, we were told, and it was in the process of being repaired. And if I remember correctly, we were taken there rather than to any cooperative in the Northwest, which is what I'd asked for. And that was where I interviewed one of the workers about what it was like to be a soldier for the Khmer Rouge during the war.
You met certain people. You also asked to meet certain inhabitants of Phnom Penh town, and you were shown people who were supposedly urban dwellers.
I believe that was a man who was Sino-Khmer. He described his life of one makeshift job, after another, working in a furniture store, repairing bicycles, that sort of thing. His testimony was enough to make me think he might have lived in Phnom Penh, but Prasit considered that, enough.
During your visit on the 17th of December, you went to Battambang, and you had asked to visit cooperatives in the Northwest. You were very disappointed, and I'll give you the floor to explain why.
Battambang was the last refuge of the Khmer Republic. It was the second city, the place where if inhabitants of Phnom Penh had the money, they would go to Battambang, and that's where the refugees who escaped often came from the Battambang province or the Battambang city. So I'd explained to Prasit that this would be key to convincing the rest of the world that, in fact, they had not committed the atrocities that were being documented through refugee testimony, because Battambang was the center of the old life and where the people would have gone. And we'd heard about, through refugee testimony, that a lot of the inhabitants had been evacuated up there. I was very disappointed, and we got into an argument. He stopped talking to me for a while.
Now, let me point out that the same day, 18th December, we have a document on record, and it is E333.1, and it is a report on the visit by the French professor and American journalist. Let me point out that this document was provided to the chamber by Mr. Ben Kiernan, and he had mentioned in a footnote in his book called The Pol Pot Regime, Power and Genocide in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. Since you had an opportunity to talk to Mr. Ben Kiernan, did you talk about that document? Did you have an opportunity to look at that book before your testimony today?
Not thoroughly, no. Could you remind me of the document, please?
Perhaps we should give this document to Mrs. Becker. It is document E333.1. The ERN in Khmer is 01047 237 to 241, and the French ERN is 010 55 093 to 96, and in English it is 0105 40 98 to rather 88 to 92. And in this report, mention is made of places you visited, people you met. You talked about photographs you were able to take. Did Mr. Ben Kiernan tell you of this document, or you discovered it only before this hearing?
No, I have a copy. I've had it for years. He shared it with me earlier. Thank you. I know it now.
And can you describe this document to us a little bit?
It's more or less accurate. You can see that they were very happy with Malcolm Caldwell. They were the least happy with me. I don't think they call me a CIA agent in this one. They call me a CIA agent in another one. You know, that he has me living all over the place, whereas I've visited. I only lived in Phnom Penh, but I visited all these provinces. It's pretty accurate that, as he says, the British professor was easy and gentle. I resist giving my impressions of what's going on, and Dick Dudman was more open about being impressed with what was going on. And you can see and hear the tension of not being able to see what we wanted to see, and they've several times wanted to stop me from taking photographs. I mean, in its way, it's accurate.
We're going to have to move on. I'm very much behind. But I would like now to speak about a discussion you had with Ieng Sary on the following day, that is to say 19 December, and you explained that you had had a dinner with Ieng Sary, and you spoke with Ieng Sary as well as with Ieng Thirith the issue of the violation of human rights, and you said the following, free translation: since war is imminent, questions with regard to human rights and the conditions of the population were irrelevant. Thirith and Sary both stated that there were no prisons in the country, that justice was done in the cooperatives by people's courts, and that was all that was said with regard to these matters. Then you wrote an article called Journey to the Heart of a New Cambodia, free translation. It's document D365/1.1.68, in which you refer to Ieng Sary's statements as follows. In order to be honest, it is Ieng Sary speaking here. With regard to these supposed massacres, we could not prevent the killings, but with relation to the complexity of the situation in Cambodia after the end of the war, the Communist Party solved the problem by applying a good solution, which avoided further slaughters, and if it had been obliged to choose another solution. And you add the following: Ieng Sary was much more interested in speaking about the war with Vietnam, and he said that this problem is a question of life and death for us, in saying that Vietnam is scheming in many, many different ways against us, including political assassinations. Does this remind you of anything?
Yes, that was the discussion at dinner.
Then you visited another cooperative, which is the cooperative of Lê Bô, when you returned from Kompong Som, because you then went to Kompong Som and you went back up, and as you traveled back north, you stopped at the Lê Bô Model Cooperative. Do you remember this cooperative, and do you remember having asked then if there were people's courts operating in these cooperatives?
I don't remember. Did I? I remember asking, but I'm not sure it was at Lê Bô.
In an article that I'm going to refer to, this is a document that is not indexed, I believe, but it has ERN numbers, English 0041 93 55 to 56, and you explained, first of all, that in this cooperative you met former city dwellers from Phnom Penh, and you also say that you asked if they existed people's courts, and that you were told that they do not exist. And you also asked how the Vietnamese war prisoners were treated, and you were answered that they were kept in a closed area and that they were sent outside to do production work, and often you asked to see these places where these war prisoners were apparently working. One day, maybe when you were joking, your guide called you to show you something that was rather special. It was a crocodile. It was a pond full of crocodiles. Do you remember that?
Yes, it was dark humor. You know, that's the old crocodile joke.
President, I have a few more questions to put, but I understand that it's time for the adjournment, so I might need an extra 20 minutes. So if the parties may accept this, I would like to continue with my questions when we resume.
President, the time is appropriate for a lunch break. We will take a break now and return at 1:30 this afternoon. to resume our hearings. And court officer, please assist the expert during the lunch break. And please invite her back into the courtroom at 1:30 this afternoon. And security guards Ieng Sary to take Khieu Samphan to the arresting room downstairs and have him return to the courtroom before 1:30 this afternoon. The court is now adjourned.